Hello and welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. Today's show is going to bring you my starts, sits, and sleepers for week 11 of the fantasy season. I'm going to give you 3 starts, 3 sits, and a sleeper at QB, running back, and tight end, and receiver, I should say. And at tight end, I'm going to give you 2 sits, 2 starts, and a sleeper there. Last week, I went 13-13 on my picks. Not my best week. Not my worst week, but it is what it is. Hopefully I do better this week for you. Overall in the season, I'm 145 and 115, 56% right on my picks. Hopefully I can keep it going. I want to push it over that 60% mark. We got to get there, and we're going to try to do it, and hopefully starting this week. All right, I'm going to give you my QB starts here to start the video, and the first one is Joe Flacco of the Cincinnati Bengals. He is first overall in fantasy quarterback scoring his last three games. He has top 20 fantasy points all 4 starts with the Bengals. He had his best game of the season his last time out, threw for 470 yards and 4 touchdowns against the Bears. He gets the Steelers this week. He played them earlier this season in week 7. He scored 29.4 points against them in that game. I know the Steelers are playing some better defense. They still have some deficiencies, especially in the secondary right now. All sorts of injuries there, and they allow the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think Flacco has another big game this week. My next start at QB is Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers. So he's been erratic this year, kind of a hard guy to trust. He's been more bad than good lately. Fewer than 15 fantasy points, 2 straight games, but he had 2 good pass defenses in those matchups. He gets a much more favorable matchup this week against the Giants. And don't forget, Love does have 2 games this year with 30-plus fantasy points, so he's more than capable of the big game. Giants have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, another team that has a lot of injuries defensively. I think Love can have one of his better games of the season this week. My next start is Jacoby Brissett of the Arizona Cardinals. So he's been a real surprise. He has at least 23 fantasy points all 4 of his starts, multiple touchdowns all of those games. He gets the 49ers, another team with a lot of injuries in the secondary, and they allow the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. They just got torched by the Rams passing game last week. They've allowed 275 plus passing yards 2 of 3 games. I think this is going to be a high scoring game. I like Brissett to produce well in this matchup. My sits now at QB. My first one is Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos. Nix has played very well at times this year, but he has really struggled at times as well, especially lately. He has fewer than 200 passing yards 5 times, including 2 straight games. He scored a season-low 9.5 fantasy points last week against a mediocre Raiders defense. And now he gets the Chiefs this week. Much better defense. They allow the 12th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, and they have allowed 200 or fewer passing yards 3 of 4 games. I think Nix could struggle again here, and he's an iffy play in my view. My next sit at QB is Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Just 13.4 fantasy points last week after 4 straight games with 20-plus fantasy points. So he had been playing well, came back down to earth last week, and that was against a really good Texans pass defense. He gets another good pass defense this week. It's the Chargers. They're a very good defensive team. They've allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. They've allowed fewer than 150 passing yards 3 straight games. Kind of crazy, but they are really playing some good football. My last sit at quarterback is Sam Darnold of the Seattle Seahawks. So Darnold has actually played really well this year. I've been impressed with his play. He's been a little bit down lately, though. He has fewer than 13 fantasy points 2 of 3 games. He really didn't do much at all last week. He threw for just 178 yards. He did have a touchdown. He threw the ball only 12 times, though, as the Seahawks defense just dominated this game. So he wasn't asked to do much, but still, he has less than 13 points 2 of 3 games. I still think he's more of a matchup play, and I don't love the matchup against the Rams this week. They're playing some really good football. They have a solid defense, and I think Darnold could struggle to post big numbers in this one. I think it could be another game for him with less than 20 fantasy points. So I would avoid Darnold in week 11. And now for my sleeper at quarterback. It is Aaron Rodgers of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Rodgers hasn't been much help to fantasy teams outside of a few games. He has less than 20 fantasy points all but 2 games. But one of those big games that he had this year came earlier this year against the Bengals. That's who he plays this week. He threw for 249 yards and 4 touchdowns against this bad Bengals defense in week 7. That's 27.05 fantasy points in that game. Cincinnati allows the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. If he's going to have a big game, I think it's going to be this week against Pittsburgh. Let's move on to the running back position, and we will start with the starts. And the first one is Woody Marks of the Houston Texans. Marks played a season-high 80% of the snaps last week. He is really emerging as the clear lead back for the Texans. He scored 16.1 fantasy points in that game and had 81 total yards. He has 12-plus fantasy points 3 of 4 games. He gets the Titans this week. They allowed a season-high 27.9 fantasy points to Marks in week 4. He had a huge game against them there, and they allowed the 5th most fantasy points to running backs on the season. I think Marks runs wild in this matchup. My next start at running back is Rico Dowdle of the Panthers. He's really becoming a must-start, a top 10 fantasy player on a weekly basis, and he's carrying this Panthers offense. He has touchdowns 2 straight games, 48 total touches in those games. He has 15-plus fantasy points 4 of 6 games. He gets the Falcons this week. They do well against the pass, but they do struggle against the run. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. Dowdle also found the end zone against the Falcons in week 3. I think he could do that again this week. My last start at running back is Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's been very consistent all year, at least 11 fantasy points, 6 games, 11-plus fantasy points, 3 of 4 games. He plays the Bengals this week. I already mentioned I like Aaron Rodgers. I like Warren as well in this matchup because he had a season-high 127 rushing yards against this Bengals team in week 7. Best fantasy game of the season. And the Bengals also allow the most fantasy points to running backs on the year. So I think this is going to be a high-scoring game. You want to get a lot of players involved from both teams here, especially Warren. My sits at running back. My first one is Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks. Walker continues to split the work at running back with Zach Charbonnet. He does have double-digit carries every game this season, but he has not had double-digit fantasy points since week 4. He's getting the work, but not producing. Now he gets the Rams this week. They allow the fewest fantasy points to running backs on the season, and they've given up fewer than 100 rushing yards 3 straight games and 6 of 7. I think Walker could struggle here. My next sit at running back, and it's a big one, it's Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens. Really tough to sit him, but if you have better options, I would really consider them this week, as Henry has getting the volume right now. 20 carries last week, but he had just 75 yards. He just hasn't had that same success as he had last year in this offense. He has not topped 20 fantasy points in a game since week 1. He gets the Browns this week. They ran 11 times. He ran 11 times for just 23 yards against the Browns in week 2. Cleveland also allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs on the season. I think Henry's going to get a lot of work again, but I just don't see him producing big in this matchup. My last sit is Breece Hall of the New York Jets. He's actually been a lot better lately, but he's been doing that against some reeling teams, some teams that are really going in the opposite direction for the season. But this offense in the New York just really scares me. It's a mess. Justin Fields has been awful throwing the ball. Teams are just going to continue to stack the box to try to stop Hall. If he doesn't get that long passing touchdown last week, his numbers aren't very good. And you have to remember, he has fewer than double-digit fantasy points 4 times this year. He has been down at times, and I think he could have one of those down games this week against New England. They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points of running backs, less than 75 rushing yards, 4 or 5 games. I think they will shut down this Jets offense. My sleeper at running back, it's Sean Tucker of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He didn't get a ton of work last week, but he still led the Bucs in rushing. He ran 9 times for 53 yards. He looked better than Rachaad White, who has not done a whole lot with his chances as the lead back in this offense. And if Tucker gets double-digit carries this week, I think he could do some real damage against Buffalo. They allow the 6th most fantasy points of running backs. Bills were just absolutely torched on the ground by the Dolphins last week. They allowed 197 rushing yards. Tucker could be a sneaky play in this matchup. Let's move on to receiver now, and we'll go with the starts. And my first one is George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. Even with CeeDee Lamb back, Pickens continues to post really solid numbers. He has at least 13 fantasy points all but the first week of the season. He's been targeted 9 times, 2 straight games, and 3 of 4. He's still getting a ton of looks. He gets the Raiders. They allow the 5th most fantasy points to receivers. The Raiders have allowed 30 or more points 2 of 3 games. I think this Cowboys offense gets rolling in this matchup, and I like Pickens to do well. My next start at receiver is Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. Addison had just 3 catches for 35 yards last week, but was targeted 11 times. That is a ton of looks and very encouraging for him, in my view, despite the poor production in that matchup. He was targeted 11 times. If he gets that many looks this week against the Bears, I think he's going to post some huge numbers. They allow the 6th most fantasy points to receivers. The Bears have allowed 711 passing yards their last 2 games. So I like Addison to do well here. My last start at receiver is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. He's red hot right now. 14 plus fantasy points, 3 straight games, at least 14 points, 5 of 6 games. He's a consistent top target in this offense. He gets this Commanders team that's really reeling right now, all sorts of injuries all over the place, and they allow the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers. They've allowed 320 plus passing yards 2 straight games. I like Waddle to do well here. My sits at receiver. My first one's Ted McMillan of the Carolina Panthers. He really is having a pretty solid rookie season, but nothing too special. And in my opinion, that's mainly because the Panthers continue to get erratic quarterback play from Bryce Young. Once that's figured out, I think the sky is the limit for McMillan, in my opinion. He could be really good, but until that happens, I don't totally trust him as an every week play. He has fewer than double-digit fantasy points 2 of 4 games. He has topped 60 yards in a game just 1 time his last 5 games. I think he could struggle this week against Atlanta. As I mentioned, not good against the run, but they're very good against the pass. McMillan had just 3 catches for 48 yards on 8 targets against Atlanta in week 3. Falcons allow the 7th fewest fantasy points to receivers. My next sit is Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. There were really high hopes for Worthy this year, and he has done some good things at times, but he just doesn't get the consistent volume to be a big-time fantasy play, in my opinion, especially with Rashee Rice back in the lineup. He has less than double-digit fantasy points 2 of 3 games. He gets a Broncos secondary that's still very good despite losing top cornerback Patrick Surtain. They still allow the fewest fantasy points to receivers. Broncos have allowed less than 200 passing yards 2 straight games as well. I don't like Worthy in this matchup. My last sit at receivers, Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. Got off to a great start this year, but he's really slowed since that. He is just 43rd overall in fantasy receiver score in his last 3 games. Just 1 game with double-digit fantasy points since week 5. He gets Miami, had that huge upset win against Buffalo last week. Their defense has actually been playing pretty well the last several weeks, and they allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to receivers on the season. I think Samuel could struggle here. My sleeper at receiver is Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. Tillman returned to the lineup last week and played 73% of the snaps. He was out there a lot. He had just 2 catches for 11 yards on 4 targets, but it was encouraging to see him play so much. And remember, early in the season, he found the end zone 2 straight games to start the year before he got hurt. And one of those games was against this week's opponent, the Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore, they allow the 4th most fantasy points to receivers and have given up at least 245 passing yards 3 straight games. I think Tillman could be a sneaky play with the Browns getting down big in this game and having to air it out, trying to play catch up. Let's move on to tight end, my last category of the video, and we will go with the starts. The first one's Cade Otton of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So he gets Buffalo this week, who is actually 1st overall in terms of fantasy points, fewest fantasy points allowed to the tight end. So that's a scary matchup. I still think Otton's a good play because the Bucs remain banged up at receiver. Otton's getting a ton of looks. He is 6th overall in tight end scoring his last 3 games. Season high 12 targets last week. He has double-digit fantasy points 4 or 5 games, so I'm not scared of the matchup. I would still start Otton in this one. I think he's a top 10 fantasy tight end. My next start at tight end is Theo Johnson of the New York Giants. Season high 8 targets last week. He had 7 catches for 75 yards. Giants are another team that's banged up a receiver. They got Darius Slayton back last week, and then he got hurt. He's iffy to play. If he's out, I like Johnson even more. Plus, Johnson has 11 plus fantasy points 3 of 4 games. He gets the Packers. They allow the 12th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season, so they struggle to stop that area of opposing offenses. So I like Johnson to do well here in week 11. My sits at tight end. My first one's Chig Okonkwo of the Tennessee Titans. He has had some big games this year, but he's really disappeared in others. Strictly a matchup play in my view, and a matchup this week against Houston is not a time to use him. They allow the fourth fewest fantasy points to tight ends, less than 180 passing yards allowed 3 straight games. He had just a catch for 4 yards against this Houston team in week 4 as well. So this is not a good time to use Okonkwo. David Njoku is my next sit at tight end. Harold Fannin is hurting. He's iffy to play. That's good news for Njoku. He could be the featured tight end this week, but I still don't totally trust him. He's had that role earlier this year as well, and he has fewer than 50 yards all but a game. He's really a touchdown-dependent player, in my opinion. He plays the Ravens this week. They're getting a little better defensively than they were earlier in the year, so I don't absolutely love Njoku in this matchup. I know I said I liked Cedric Tillman, but I think he could be a better fit to make a big play in this matchup than Njoku trying to beat those linebackers in coverage. My sleeper at tight end, it's Noah Fant of the Cincinnati Bengals. Fant has found the end zone 2 of 3 games. He has at least 6.7 fantasy points, 4 straight games. That shows a pretty good floor with him. Not flashy numbers, but consistent. He plays the Steelers this week. I already mentioned this matchup several times. Obviously, I like it from a fantasy perspective, and I like it for Fant as well. He scored 14.4 fantasy points against the Steelers in week 7, and they also allow the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends. All right, those are my start, sits, and sleepers for week 11 of the fantasy football season. Good luck to you in all your games this week. I hope you have a lot of success. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports.